All right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Yes. Wait, is Mr. Richmond's class representing? I thought maybe like some of my actual students were in here tonight. I was thinking, whoa, that would be something. Okay. So as far as that, we've got folks here. Good to see y'all tonight. And our focus area tonight is going to be the Cold War. Now, of course, we can take questions from other areas as well. Really, it depends on where you are right now, and that's fine. You know what? Let me go ahead and make a poll because I would like to see, where are y'all right now? Okay, where are y'all right now? Let's see. So pre-depression. Okay, so Great Depression. Let's see. Great Depression, World War II, and then let's see who's at post World War II. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at post World War II. All right, so I've just put a poll out there. If y'all can help me out, let's go ahead and we've got the poll out right now. So let me know where y'all are, because the thing is, if this is not where y'all are, that's fine. Remember that just because we put an emphasis area out there does not mean that that has to be the basis for what we're doing. Okay, but it does look like a lot of y'all are on post World War II. But if there are questions about the Great Depression and World War II, that's still totally okay, because what happens this time of year, it really gets to where classes are doing all kinds of different stuff. Okay, so as far as that goes, yeah, if you use the numbered periods ever, then a 1 is coming your way. Yeah, it's like, remember, the exam never uses numbered periods. So what I'm looking at here, it looks like about half of you are post-World War II, and then half of you approximately are on the Great Depression, World War II. So let me make it clear that you can ask questions about the Great Depression and World War II. Okay, so don't think that we have to restrict this to the Cold War. But we do have a lot of people who are in the post-war era. So remember, go in and yes, I did get a haircut. Thanks for noticing. Of course, if this were AP Euro, I'd refuse to answer your question, and I'd say empiricism. But since this isn't AP Euro, then we're just going to go ahead and say, yes, I got a haircut. Thanks for noticing. All right. And so as far as that goes, let's go ahead and move on to our questions and see what we've got there. Remember, you can ask a question about any APUSH related thing that you want. All right. So going into that, okay, excellent. Okay, I said okay. Not okay. So anyway, let's see. Okay, Kayla's getting us some stuff here, and this is this is good. This is good. I'm seeing some great stuff. So let's go ahead and get into the questions. All right. So let's go ahead and kind of, we need kind of a big picture, but we can kind of start with a sort of microscopic sort of thing here. Okay. So why did both nations decide to limit nuclear weapons after the Cuban Missile Crisis? Okay. So as far as that goes, stay hydrated, kids. And so as far as this goes, the Cold War starts off with the idea of massive retaliation. Okay, if we look at the Eisenhower administration, they're thinking in terms of massive retaliation, mutually assured destruction. Now, before that, Harry Truman is focusing on the strategy of containment. So containing communism where it is, and then if the communists ever go on the offensive, then there will be massive retaliation. In the 1950s, there was this expectation. This is like, if any of y'all have ever seen that Duck and Cover video, like dum dum, tweedledum dum, tweedledum dum, tweedledum dum, and it goes on to Bert the Turtle, and it's like, you duck and cover, duck and cover. That is 1950s, okay? That basically everybody is worried about, is there going to be a nuclear attack? And the strategy is to attack back, okay? Which, when you think about this is kind of, it's kind of stupid in a way, because it's a strategy that, well, I mean, I guess it worked because nobody attacked, because you think, well, if somebody attacks, then everybody dies, okay? But you can see how that would be a little bit off-putting, okay? So when you think about, like, maybe there needs to be another way. And so when JFK was president, he starts, starts embracing the doctrine of limited war. All right. And so what we're talking about here is in terms of instead of assuming that the next war is going to be a nuclear war, then what about a limited war? Okay. So that's where he starts training, the Green Berets and, special forces and stuff like that. And then we see wars like in Korea and Vietnam, which were not nuclear wars, but they were still wars nonetheless. And so as far as that's going, now the Cuban Missile Crisis represents like what you're supposed to do before the Cuban Missile Crisis is brinkmanship. Okay, brinkmanship is going right up to the line, to the brink. Like if I am on the brink, that means that I'm right before the jump off point. Okay, that if I take another step, I'm going to fall down into the canyon. All right. And so brinkmanship is going as close up to the line and, beating your chest and thinking like, okay, what's going to happen from here? And so with that, the Cuban Missile Crisis, we see these missiles on Cuba. Kennedy blockades Cuba, and then the Soviets, Khrushchev sends the Soviet Navy. And of course, there is a 13-day standoff where the Soviet Navy is on its way to Cuba. Kennedy is quarantining Cuba with the US Navy, and nobody knows what's going to happen, because if the Soviet Navy gets to the United States Navy and there is a conflict, then this could lead to nuclear war. That everybody is, oh, that's pretty awesome, Ultra Wig. But everybody is wondering what is going to happen now. I mean, you've got to imagine, like, this all in the newspapers and on the TV and all of that. Are we going to have nuclear war? And when that is finally settled, okay, that when they're almost in contact, finally they make this deal, okay, that, the Soviets will pull their missiles from Cuba, and then the Soviets kind of get what it is that they wanted, that the United States is going to pull its missiles out of Turkey, okay? So we had put missiles on Turkey. This is before ICBMs. Like today, you can launch a missile from North Dakota and it can hit anywhere. You could go straight from North Dakota to North Korea without having to go anywhere. Just push a button. This is before that. So we had missiles on Turkey, and so we had to pull the missiles off of Turkey, and then the Soviets pulled their missiles from Cuba. And so after that, they start to think in terms of, when you get to Nixon, for example. Now, Kennedy did talk about, and that's one thing I love about JFK. Okay, that JFK is a president that is easy to love, I think. I mean, he was somebody that was very, very tough on communism, okay, very tough on communism. But at the same time, Kennedy had this idea, we need to think about the end goal. Now, I tell you, sometimes when I'm driving home from work in my car and I need a little bit of inspiration, I will listen to JFK's Ich bin ein Berliner speech, because this speech is like, he talks, it's almost like a wrestling, okay, like WWE sort of thing, that he's like, look, that when they're very charismatic. And so when we look at Ich bin ein Berliner, and this is where what I love about JFK, he was completely like uncompromising, in his standing up to communism. Now I'm trying to find a script, okay, because he was answering a lot of people who said that, like, maybe communism is not that bad, okay, and he has this constant refrain, okay. So let me go ahead and I'm going to share my screen with you for a second. And so as far as that, this is, but JFK, I think, is really my favorite Cold War president. Also, Lana Del Rey's favorite Cold War president as well. So, the thing is, let me go ahead and share this with you. And let's see, the screen is sharing, but maybe it's not. Okay, so let's see. It's supposed to be. I'm pressing to share the screen, and it just is. Oh, there we go. Now it's going to share. Okay, got it. So what he said here is he's talking to people who want to compromise with communism. And he says here that there are many people in the world who really don't understand, or say they don't, what is the great issue between the free world and the communist world. Let them come to Berlin. There are some who say There are some who say that communism is the wave of the future. Let them come to Berlin. And there are some who say in Europe and in elsewhere, we can work with the communists. Let them come to Berlin. Now, remember, keep in mind that we're looking at, occupied Germany. Okay, so when we're looking at occupied Germany, we're seeing that Berlin is in the middle of the Soviet sector. Now, the Soviets were our allies in World War II, and it quickly turns a little different after that, okay, because they divided up into zones of occupation, and we see that Berlin is in the middle of the Soviet sector. Now, in the, as far as that goes, that then Khrushchev decides, because a lot of people, they realize I can just get into West Berlin and then I can fly out. Okay, I can just fly out of West Berlin and I can be I can be a free person. And so Khrushchev does something that our president might have approved of. He built a wall. And so the Berlin Wall has basically got West Berlin really in this enclave. Okay, in this enclave, what Kennedy said is that you live in a defended island of freedom, he tells these people. And so as far as that goes, he's talking about this this whole thing that he says, and there are even a few who say that it is true that communism is an evil system, but it permits us to make economic progress. Lass sie nach Berlin kommen. Let them come to Berlin. Okay, and so as far as that goes, that's Kennedy's like very tough rhetoric. And so with that, that is his really tough talk on communism. But his goal was not to like be in a perpetual state of war. That JFK also had this idea that our ultimate goal is world peace. Okay, that our ultimate goal is world peace. Who's trying to send me an email? I'm not sure what's happening there. All right, so as far as that goes, that in his American University speech, which has a much different tone than this, he starts talking about it. It's like, especially after the Cuban Missile Crisis, that we have to think about. Oh, gotcha. Yeah, that is something we need to work on, isn't it? So with that, Kennedy starts thinking about this, and then when Nixon comes in, now I've got a video on Richard Nixon's foreign policy, but when Nixon comes in, Nixon and Kissinger have this détente policy. Okay, now détente is not like detention. It's not like you go to after-school detention or lunch detention or something like that. Okay, that détente, it's detention. Okay, detention. That there's this idea that we need to get out of this whole kind of Cold War mentality where we're at each other's throats. And I'm trying to get to my slides here on Nixon's foreign policy, and just to kind of show you some things here, okay? Because this is when we're going to start really getting into these arms limitations, okay? Which really sounds a little bit like Woodrow, kind of reminiscent of Woodrow Wilson. And so as far as that goes, that Nixon, what we're looking at there is détente, okay, détente, because when you think about it, the tension, okay, that was there between the free world and the communist world was, a situation where it wasn't sustainable, okay? So Kennedy had this view of we need something to be sustainable, we need peace, but Nixon's the one that brings it about, okay? Nixon and his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger. Now, Henry Kissinger was a German, so of course he was inspired, if any of you've taken AP Euro in the past, by Otto von Bismarck and his, Realpolitik strategy, that we deal with other nations based on practical rather than ideological concerns. And of course, that is when Nixon goes to China and, creates formal relations between the Chinese and the United States, the Chinese communists in the United States. And so as far as that goes, we eventually get into, SALT 1, SALT 2, all of that kind of stuff, the strategic arms limitation talks. And so that's really, the Cuban Missile Crisis, you want to remember brinkmanship, okay? As far as that goes, you want to remember brinkmanship. So going on with that, we're going to go ahead and go with that. What did the Potsdam Conference accomplish? Okay, now the Yalta Conference was really about mostly like the settlement with Germany. Okay, so the Yalta Conference is like, how are we going to divide Germany? And then, of course, making the UN. The Potsdam Conference was, basically dealing with Japan, and that is where the Allies demanded an unconditional surrender from the Japanese and warned that we've got a weapon. Okay, we've got a weapon that we are willing to use. Okay, and so as far as that goes, that is dealing with Japan. And that's really, I think, for APUS history, the main thing that you would want to note here, that at the Potsdam Conference, they demanded an unconditional surrender. Okay, so an unconditional surrender. And so as far as that, yeah, that's really what you would get into there with the Potsdam Conference. I'm not going to make a long answer out of that because that's pretty straightforward. All right, did Reagan end the Cold War? Okay, now let's think about this. Now, of course, we get into Owen, what we want to remember when we ask questions like, did Reagan end the Cold War? We get into historical judgment. Okay, and so when it comes down to it, when we start thinking about it, it's like there are a lot of different factors, and people are going to interpret that in different ways. So, for example, that Nixon came in. Nixon, Ford, and Carter. They're the detente presidents, okay? When we get into the late 60s and through the 70s, thank y'all so much for the blessings. And so then Nixon wasn't Potsdam. Nixon wasn't Potsdam. That was like, Potsdam was a World War II conference, okay? Yeah, Truman was at Potsdam. That's a World War II conference that dealt with demanding an unconditional surrender from Japan. And so as far as that goes, that Nixon came in, Nixon and Kissinger, with this detente policy. And so going from there, Ford and Carter also got the detente policy. Okay, they were into the detente policy as well. And so Reagan is campaigning for president in 1980, and we start to see a revival of this like Cold War spirit. That Ronald Reagan said that, I want to be tough on communism. And Reagan really was the toughest president on communism in the sense that Reagan also abandoned, not only did he increase military spending and, he brought back the rhetoric about the Soviet Union. Okay, so Kennedy was, I think, the last president before Reagan, and really Reagan, you can see echoes of JFK there. Okay, so as far as that goes, you can see echoes of JFK in Ronald Reagan. That when you're dealing with this, first of all, like Reagan, well, not first of all, it's almost near the end of his term, but Reagan also gave a speech in Berlin, just like Kennedy. And so as far as that goes, what we're looking at is Reagan is bringing back kind of that pre-Cuban Missile Crisis idea, okay? So going into that Reagan is escalating things, and really, as somebody's saying here, communism ended the Cold War, that by this time, see, when Kennedy became president, it wasn't obvious who was winning. Like, one of the things Kennedy did when he was running for president is he talked about a missile gap, okay? There were a lot of people in the late 1950s, especially with the launching of Sputnik, that believed like, oh, the Soviets are winning this thing. I mean, after all, they put a dog in space, they put a man in space, they put a satellite in space. We haven't done any of that yet, okay? They did all of these things here, and people were panicked in the late 1950s. And so by the time Reagan comes along, it's very obvious that that freedom has won out. Okay, that the idea of a liberal democracy, and I mean liberal democracy in the international sense. Okay, whereas when Ronald Reagan was traveling internationally, he would talk about liberalism or liberalization or whatever. And so as far as that goes, that liberal democracy and a market-driven economy. Now, not a complete laissez-faire economy necessarily when you look at Europe, but a market-driven economy that's driven by consumers, not by government central planning. It was very evident that we were winning. And so Reagan is thinking like, well, let's basically bring them to the breaking point by escalating our military spending to a point where they can't keep up. And then, of course, these speeches. He went and gave a speech in the about 1982 to the British Parliament, where he said it's time to throw Marxism and Leninism onto the ash heap of history. And then he gave a speech before the American Association of Evangelicals, which, of course, that was part of the conservative movement, was that the Republican Party was bringing in these evangelical Christians. And so with that, Ronald Reagan gave his Evil Empire speech, okay, which the Evil Empire speech is so as far as just the power of it, this is a very audience-driven thing. Okay, so as far as that goes, that the audience is really driving this. Okay, so with that, let me go ahead and show you something, because I want to show you an audience consideration. Okay, so Reagan Evil Empire speech. Okay, so we're going to look at Reagan's Evil Empire speech, and let me see his full text. Okay, now I want to get into the whole idea when we talk about on the exam. Okay, when we're talking about audience and how does audience affect something, like you talk to your friends, your teachers, and your parents in different ways. Okay, and let's think about this, that the Evil Empire speech is a speech that Ronald Reagan gave before the American Association of Evangelicals. And so he's speaking to an audience of evangelical Christians, and so he wants to get them on board with his with his anti-communist platform. So as far as that, what he says here, okay, is, and this is something that if we saw this as a document, so Ronald Reagan delivered before like the American Association of Evangelicals, okay, so he's talking to evangelical Christians, and he says, a number of years ago, I heard a young father, a very prominent young man in the entertainment world, addressing a tremendous gathering in California. It was during the time of the Cold War, and communism and our way of life were very much on people's minds. Now, see where Reagan talks about it was during the Cold War. You know, I mean, the 1980s are technically, we think about Cold War, but this is like during, pre-Nixon, pre-Detente. And so Reagan says he was speaking to that subject. And suddenly, though, I heard him saying, I love my little girls more than anything. And I said to myself, oh, no, you can't. Don't say that. Now, the reason why Reagan's saying this is because he thought the guy was going to go on a better red than dead rant. That's something that some people said that when it comes down to it, and that's what Kennedy was speaking to at Berlin, that if we need to find some way to compromise with the communists, then we need to do that in order to keep the world from being blown up. And so for Reagan, for a conservative like Reagan, it's like, no, don't say stuff like that. And so he says here, but I had underestimated him. He went on, I would rather see my little girls die now, still believing in God, than have them grow up under communism and one day die no longer believing in God. Now, note here, applause, massive applause. Okay, so Ronald Reagan, the great communicator, when we think about the audience considerations, that Reagan wants evangelical Christians on board with his anti-communist campaign. And when you think about it, like evangelical Christians might be a demographic that would say, well, we don't want to be too tough because we don't want war. But Reagan's saying, look, this is a contest between people who believe in God and people who don't, that our enemies are, dirty communist atheists. And if you love Jesus, then you need to be on board. And that's what Reagan is doing here. His audience is affecting what he's saying. And the purpose of what he's doing here is to rally evangelical Christians around the Cold War, around his Cold War policies. And so that's something like when we think about audience, when you think about your POV plus context, audience, purpose, okay? And so when we think about that, how does the audience that's being addressed affect what's being said. And that's what made Ronald Reagan the great communicator. So as far as that goes, that, Reagan did do some things that he started pushing harder. Also, Reagan, another thing to note here is he went beyond Harry Truman, Harry Truman's policy of containment, which was the policy throughout the Cold War, this policy of containment. And so with the policy of containment, we're not stopping, we're stopping communism from spreading, but we're not going to try to roll it back. Now, this is nice because you've got two R's here, Reagan, rollback. Okay. And so Reagan was committed to actually rolling back communism, saying that the United States will support, anti-communist guerrillas. Now, some of this he did under the table. The whole thing about the Iran-Contra scandal was that his administration was illegally selling arms to Iran in order to fund the Contras in Latin America, in Nicaragua, I believe, that these were anti-communist guerrillas that were fighting a far left government and far left communist aligned government, and they were taking the money from these illegal sales of arms to Iran, who was at the time an enemy of the United States, is still certainly not our friend, and so then diverting that money off the books to finance the Contras. And so when it comes down to it, it's kind of hard for me to be mad at somebody for fighting communism, but it's kind of similar to what Nixon did, like when he sent troops into Cambodia during the Vietnam War. That basically, the thing is, when we look at the Ho Chi Minh Trail, okay, so when we're thinking about the Vietnam War, now, again, Nixon probably should have informed folks, but when we're thinking about the Ho Chi Minh Trail, this is really the ridiculous thing about the Vietnam War. Let me go ahead and show you this because, you need to understand why it is that Nixon was doing this, okay? So Nixon's trying to bring about an end to the Vietnam War, but what was going on is that, our troops, American troops, were in South Vietnam. Now, this whole thing is, this whole area, Indochina, where you have Thailand, Laos, Cambodia. And so what happened here is where our troops were, okay? So our troops were confined to South Vietnam. But the way that the North Vietnamese government was getting supplies to the Viet Cong is they were going through Cambodia. And so as they're going through Laos and Cambodia, it's like, well, they basically got base. If you think about when you are when you're playing tag when you're little and, you're on base, I'm on base. And this is what they got to do. And so Nixon, in order to try to bring about a swift end to the Vietnam War, is thinking we've got to cut off the trail. But he didn't have authorization from Congress to do that. And so with that, Nixon then, without congressional authorization, authorized American troops to be sent into Cambodia without any consent from Congress. So it's a very similar thing. Like sometimes the president does something that maybe is not wrong in the abstract, but it's not authorized by Congress. So the Iran-Contra scandal, it's something that was it was a noble endeavor, but at the same time, it was not something that Congress had ever authorized, and it was done off the books. And so when it comes down to it, really communism, I think the prevailing school of thought is that it collapsed on itself. But I also think that, Reagan certainly didn't, I think that Reagan escalated things a bit by, really seeing that communism was on the breaking point and giving it that necessary push. All right. So as far as that, now, as far as rewatching the session later, ladies and gentlemen, rewatching the session later, go to fiveable.me and look into purchasing Fiveable Plus. Now, these weekly sessions through the end of April are absolutely free to watch live. Fiveable Plus members get access to the replays, and also they will have let's see, this is right when, so when it comes down to it, that, this is where you can also get access to cram sessions that are going to be happening during the, during right before the exam. So, and also Fiveable Plus is going to be more expensive right before the exam because that's when people care about it. Most people study for, there's a group that starts studying seriously for the exam 2 weeks out, and then there's another group studying for the exam 2 days out. Okay, so as far as that, how did the U.S. influence public opinion during the Cold War? What are we talking about here? I'm not exact. Ultra Wig, if you could perhaps, if you could perhaps maybe rephrase your question so that's a little bit more clear. I'm going to go to this one. How did the Cold War start? Okay. So as far as that goes, I showed y'all that that map of occupied Germany. All right. So after World War II, now, of course, what had happened here is the Germans and the Russians had fought two wars against each other. Okay, so yeah, some of y'all, those of you who are here, yeah, y'all are way ahead of the game. So Fiveable's trying to help you by offering Fiveable Plus at a discount right now. So for those of you who are actually seriously studying, but as far as how the Cold War started, okay, when we look at how the Cold War started, the Soviets, they had, the Soviets, the Russians, whatever you want to call them at the same time, depending on World War I, II, all of that, but they had been attacked by the Germans twice, okay, and Stalin says, look, I need a sphere of influence, okay? And this is what's called the Eastern Bloc, okay? So let me go ahead and make sure you've got a map here, okay? So we're looking at the Eastern Bloc, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here again, all right? And so we're talking about the Eastern Bloc. So Stalin says, now remember, these countries are not part of the Soviet Union, okay? So there are countries like, you notice, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine. These are part of the Soviet Union. Now, the Eastern Bloc countries, these are countries that were not part of the Soviet Union, but Stalin said he needed a sphere of influence to make sure that the Soviet Union was never attacked by the Germans again. And so what happens here is like Romania, Bulgaria, you see what was then Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, and of course, East Germany. Okay, so these countries are at that time, like, they're basically these puppet governments are put in there. And what's happening is it becomes very evident early on that the Soviets are making sure that these governments are friendly, and they're not going to allow these countries to function as democracies. So these countries are kind of independent in name only. And until Gorbachev comes around, then, what we're seeing there is, basically anytime there was any kind of liberalization or something like that, the Soviets sent in troops. And so what happens here is Winston Churchill, the prime minister of the UK during World War II, and for a bit again in the 1950s, that Winston Churchill said when he gave a speech actually at a university, at a college commencement in Harry Truman's home state of Missouri. The speech was called Sinews of Peace, but we often call it the Iron Curtain speech. And so Winston Churchill talked about an Iron Curtain is going, is being laid across Europe. And then there, of course, was the Long Telegram and NSC 68. Okay, so a couple of things here. If we're looking at what's going on in the Eastern Bloc, NSC 68. Okay, so NSC 68 is a National Security Council, publication, and this was presented to Harry Truman in April of 1950. Now, the Long Telegram. This is something that was right after World War II. Okay, so as far as the Long Telegram or the the X article, So as far as that goes, the Long Telegram. Okay, and this is George Kennan. Okay, this is George Kennan's Long Telegram. And this is something that basically, as far as that goes, that Kennan is trying to say here. And he is somebody who was who was a State Department official, ambassador to the Soviet Union. Okay, well, actually a little bit later. Okay, but he's basically a guy who knows a good bit about the Soviets. And so what he said here, this is in 1947, and he presents these assumptions, okay, that essentially that the Soviets, they are at war with capitalism, that they are going to, they're going to use. Now, the other thing here, if it's foreshadowing McCarthyism, the USSR would use controllable Marxists in the capitalist world as allies. So it's a, which they did, if we look at the Alger Hiss case and a few other cases, that the Soviets view themselves as being at war with the United States and the capitalist world, that they are going to spy on us, that there is, there's not going to, as far as that goes, that this culture and that the United States is going to have to be strong, okay? That the Soviets respect strength. And that is what they're, that's what they respect. That's what they get into. And so as far as that goes, we see here that in 1950 that we start to see this blueprint for, remember that after World War I, the United States demilitarized, reduction of arms, along the guidelines of the 14 points. And so NSC 68 and the long telegram, these are two policy instruments. Now, you would use these in an essay or, an SAQ as illustrative examples, okay? Illustrative examples. And so as far as that goes, that's what you're getting into with the Cold War, that you want to get into, you want to look at the long telegram, NSC 68, the Iron Curtain. Those are things that I would look at there. All right, and so let's see here. How did Cold War foreign policies? Okay, so let's just, again, I'm going to go through just real quick here. Okay, so Truman, now, first of all, it's Harry Truman who's got the policy of containment. Yeah, let me be clear, Rhea. Like I'm a big fan of Wikipedia. Like I don't think textbooks are really necessary anymore. There's nothing in a textbook. Wikipedia is just basically an online textbook, if you think about it that way. There are some teachers who act like that it's not credible. Now, I wouldn't cite it in a paper, but when you look at a Wikipedia article, they've cited things. There's nothing wrong with going into Wikipedia, seeing the things that they're citing, and using that stuff in your paper if you actually look at it. So as far as that goes, that Truman, Harry Truman, who was president until 1953, his administration had this doctrine of containment. All right, so basically, we're going to try to keep communism where it is and not let it spread. Now, of course, it did spread a bit into Korea, and that, of course, was the Korean War was something of of course, China. Okay, so spread into China, and of course, the Korean War was an attempt to keep the entire Korean peninsula from falling to communism. So Truman, it's about containment. And the Korean War, of course, was not first of all, wasn't an official war, right? But second of all, wasn't a nuclear war or anything like that. Now, by the 1950s, the Soviets have procured nuclear weapons, okay? So that's really a game changer. And so that's what we want to remember about the Eisenhower administration and the policy of massive retaliation. So everything to do with the Eisenhower administration was about building up our nuclear arsenal and making sure that we were ready if the Soviets were to attack, okay, with nuclear weapons, then we would attack them back, all right? And so Kennedy comes in, and Kennedy is really, like I said, he's getting into this idea of limited war and counterinsurgency and stuff like that. And that kind of carries on into Johnson. Now, of course, Lyndon Johnson is the one who goes into Vietnam, just guns blazing, with us having 500,000 Americans over there at one point. And so with that, we go into the Nixon administration. Now, Nixon, of course, was dedicated to fighting communism, dedicated to the policy of containment, but also going into this realpolitik, kind of mentality. All right. So as far as that goes, the realpolitik, opening up relations with China. Now, this is what's important about Nixon, that Nixon, when we look at realpolitik, they discovered that there is a rift between the Soviets and the Chinese, okay? The Soviets and the Chinese, they're both communist, but there is tension there. And so the United States could go in and exploit that rift by going in and creating an economic and diplomatic relationship with the Chinese. Now, also with that policy of detente, we start to see an emphasis on maybe we should do something to limit arms and stuff like that. So SALT, the strategic arms limitation talks. Okay, that's what you're starting to see there. So as we go into the 1970s, okay, we start to see the first discussions between the U.S. and the USSR. And also at that time in the 1970s, we have yes, got it. Nice job, Rhea. And so with that, one thing that I want to show off as well. Notice Gerald Ford out there in the he's out there in the Soviet Union. He is wearing a hat. Okay, he's like wearing like a Russian style hat. When you think about that, this is really that continuity with the policy of détente. There is Nixon with Brezhnev, and then there is Carter with Brezhnev, with his counterpart in the Soviet Union. Now, of course, Reagan. We have discontinuity here with the détente policy, that Reagan comes in and he says that the détente policy is no good and we need to go back to the 1950s and 60s talking tough. And also Reagan said that it's time to roll back communism. Now, another thing about Nixon that we want to note, specifically in reference to the Vietnam War, is the Nixon Doctrine, okay, that the United States is more than willing to give financial assistance, military assistance, now as far as military equipment and money, but we are not going to send troops, okay? So he says here, we shall look to the nation directly threatened to assume the primary responsibility of providing the manpower for its defense. Vietnam got a little bit out of hand in terms of we were fighting another country's war for them, and that really kind of fell apart. So with the Nixon Doctrine, we'll send money, we'll send weapons, we're not going to send troops, okay? And so with the Nixon Doctrine, you see what was called Vietnamization, okay, of the war, that basically we will continue to provide equipment, but you are going to have your troops with our tanks, okay? So you see there, your troops are tanks. And that is the substance of the Nixon Doctrine. I would say that your most important presidents at this time, you want to know Truman, containment, Eisenhower, massive retaliation. Nixon is a big deal there with the détente policy. And then, of course, you see that Reagan was resuming that very tough line against communism. And so what was the United States foreign policy during the Cold War? Okay, so again, I've kind of answered variants of this question already. But remember, containment, that is a pretty universal thing, that we are dedicated to stopping the spread of communism. Massive retaliation, which was an Eisenhower, approach. Then we get into Nixon and détente, and then Reagan, rollback. Now, also remember with Nixon, realpolitik, okay, that we're not looking at this ideologically. We're looking at U.S. foreign policy in terms of what is best for the United States and what is best for our geopolitical power. All right. Is there a way to practice multiple choice, see the correct answer? What do you mean there? I would go see my friends at Albert.io. Albert.io has a whole bunch of, they've got a whole library of questions. And if you email hello, if you subscribe to Albert.io, hello@albert.io. If you email them, if you subscribe to Albert and email them and say that like Tom Ritchie sent you, then that's something that you can get some, you can get a discount there. They'll discount at $5. Okay, how was society? Okay, this is that's really a general question, Dino. It's not really set up for me to answer in something like this. Okay, so as far as the importance of Berlin, okay, so as I mentioned before, but I haven't really just dedicated something to this, that Berlin was basically in the middle of the Soviet sector. Okay, so when we go to Allied occupied Germany, let me go ahead and share the screen again. All right. So the importance of Berlin. all right, is because, it's right there in the Soviet sector. Now, what happened is that there was a railroad here. Okay, there was a rail line that could go back and forth from West Germany to West Berlin. And at first, there were, you could tell. I mean, the British, the French, the Americans occupied the majority of Berlin, and then the Soviets had about a third of it. And so as far as that goes, at first, people could walk back and forth between East and West Berlin. Now, what Stalin tried to do was the Berlin Blockade. Okay, the Berlin Blockade, that was in 1948 and 49. Stalin wanted to test the resolve of the Allies here, and what he wanted to do is essentially they had this railroad line that they cut off. And so what Stalin was trying to get the United States and Britain and France to do was to abandon West Berlin, to say that we can't stay here because we can't supply it. So Stalin is thinking, yeah, you're welcome to be there, but if you can't bring in enough food to feed these people, then you're going to have to give it up. And so what we see here is that the Allies engineer the Berlin Airlift. And so we see that there are there is this 24/7 line of planes that are going through here, what they call Operation Vittles. And so non-stop planes being flown with supplies. You see how these are guys that are loading milk. Okay, so essentially this city is being supplied with the necessaries of life by plane. And so it went on for several months in 1948 and 1949. And so finally that ended. Finally, Stalin lifted the blockade. He saw that the Allies weren't going to give it up, but it went on for nearly a year. And so with that, then you have, of course, the Berlin Wall. Okay, so the Berlin Wall. Now this was a Khrushchev project. Okay, so this was, by the time it got to 1960, it was evident that people were getting out of the eastern part and all of that. And so what you see here is this, you see where not only now on one side of the wall, on the West Berlin side of the wall, you could just walk right by the wall. You could put graffiti on it or whatever you wanted to do. But you notice here on the other side of the wall, we see that there is this large area here. Okay, there's this very large area. And so then there's a fence, then there's this open area. You'll see that, there are some people who tried to get out and they were machine gunned. I don't know if we'll see that. There was something in the Wikipedia photos at some point. Now that's an interesting thing there. All right. So let's see. Now I don't see what happened to that, but they do have some people. Now this may be, this is victims of the wall with graffiti. All right. So as far as that goes, that's the importance of Berlin, is that Berlin, as Kennedy called it, a defended island of freedom. Okay, a defended island of freedom. And so with that, we're going to go on to the next part here. But yes, Berlin was very important. And of course, where Ronald Reagan went, to the same place where Kennedy had made his speech, where he made his iconic statement, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Okay, so as far as that, the difference between the goals of the U.S. and the USSR. All right, so going into that, let's see what we've got here. All right, so going into the goals of the U.S. and the USSR. All right, so pretty much what you're looking at here is that before World War II, we saw the world in terms of great powers. Okay, so Britain, France, Germany, Russia, the United States. All right, so you're looking at these great powers. And so after the war, what you start to see is, well, Britain and France and Germany, they're all in a situation where, it's just like, I mean, they've been torn apart by the war. And so the United States, helps out Western Europe with the Marshall Plan. Okay, the Marshall Plan was a program of foreign aid that was given to these governments to try to rebuild. Okay, to try to rebuild, but it's also we want to make sure that these countries don't fall to communism. There seemed to be a very credible threat of a communist, not necessarily a full communist takeover in France, but there was a very vibrant communist party in France right after the war. And so that's something that, we're sending money to try to keep these countries from falling to communism. And so the United States is really taking a leadership role, which is much different from the United States after World War I. Now, the United States wasn't totally and completely isolationist after World War I, but the United States was reluctant to take on a permanent leadership role in this sense. And so as far as that goes, that the United States helps organize NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Okay, so the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that was organized. Okay, so when we look at NATO, now of course today we see that NATO's gotten a lot larger than it was during the Cold War. I think I forget if there's a Cold War map here or not, but today we see that most European countries are part of NATO. Looks like, with the exception of Ireland, Switzerland. Let's see, so Sweden, Finland, but most, former Yugoslavia, Austria, but most of these countries in Europe are part of NATO today. And so NATO is essentially a mutual defense pact. Every member of NATO, every one of these countries in blue, the United States has promised that if that country is invaded, the United States will go to defend it. Now, that's a lot different than after World War I, where the United States said, we don't want to be a part of the League of Nations. We don't want to be brought into a war. And so what we see here is that in 1949, it was a handful of European countries. And okay, looks like Turkey came and went. Now they're back again. And then notice that, okay, now I don't know why that's set up like that. Let's see, already blue. Now, they make it blank to bring attention to it. Now, Spain, noticed in the 1980s. Now, Spain had kind of been marginalized for a while because of Francisco Franco, which Generalissimo Franco wasn't necessarily a fascist, but he was allied with, he accepted help from Hitler and Mussolini, and had an authoritarian government. Now, of course, eventually, Franco's government was recognized by the United States and other countries because it was reliably anti-communist. And so going from there, we see how NATO, of course, there was a massive NATO expansion after the fall of the Soviet Union. And so the other side of this, okay, now the Soviet Union, what we're looking at is what they call like hegemony, I think, if I'm pronouncing this right, that basically, the Soviet Union, you've got Europe here during the Cold War, that these are the NATO aligned countries. Now, Greece and Turkey, these were the two countries most closely associated with the Truman Doctrine, okay, of Greece and Turkey. And so those countries are brought in that we're not going to let communism get there. And so the Soviet Union, of course, has, the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. Okay, so when we're looking there, and so that's essentially, really you can look at this from an ideological perspective, but also there's really an element of geopolitical dominance here, and of course that goes through different phases there. But as far as that goes, the United States is trying to advance, a philosophy that is based on democratically elected governments, and free markets and free information and all of the things that we see enshrined in our Constitution and Bill of Rights and our way of life. And then, of course, the Soviets believe that the way to go is central planning. Am I forgetting decolonization? Okay, which, how does decolonization come in? If we were talking about AP Euro, I might go into that a little bit more, but decolonization, I've never really seen that come up as a major issue in a, on the U.S. history exam, but definitely something that I would, talk about if we were talking about AP Euro. All right. So what is the lasting impact of the United States assassinating? That's interesting. That's an interesting lasting impact. But Alden, I will say that we want to look at, when we think about the age of imperialism, that there certainly is a lasting impact from that age, which even today the United States is, the situation in Venezuela. The United States has recognized, the counter president. But what you see, though, is that most of Latin America also recognizes the counter president in Venezuela. All right. So the recognized first lady of Venezuela, I think I saw on the president's Instagram today, that she visited the White House today. So the thing is that one thing I would say, and that's another thing that we need to talk about in terms of JFK, started the Peace Corps and the Alliance for Progress. Okay. So if you're thinking about the Cold War in Latin America, there are two things that if you're, and hopefully when you're watching these things, you've got a pen and paper. But a couple things about the Cold War in Latin America, the Organization of American States. Okay, so the Organization of American States was founded in 1948. Okay, and of course has its headquarters in Washington, D.C. And this is an organization that was created in order to make sure that the Americas were united against communism. Now, of course, Cuba for a while was kicked out of the Organization of American States, but basically this was created to make sure that there is, that there is dialogue, that there is cooperation between American states. And notice here that we see that all of these different American states, and notice that the United States, it looks like maybe they're in alphabetical order. So it's not, what you see here is that the United States isn't being shown as dominant, it's being shown as just another one of these flags. But at the same time, the United States certainly had a hand in setting this up. And so then John F. Kennedy started the Alliance for Progress, okay, the Alliance for Progress, which this was something that JFK had in mind. This was a, basically establishing economic cooperation. I would say that you could compare the Marshall Plan in some ways to Kennedy's Alliance for Progress, that Kennedy's Alliance for Progress is trying to do in Latin America something very similar to what, what Truman's Marshall Plan was trying to do in Europe. So I think that the Organization of American States and the Alliance for Progress, these are both very good to note in the, in the Cold War in Latin America. Now, I know I kind of use this question as a starting point for actually getting into stuff that's going to be on the exam. But we want to make sure that we understand that. And also that although Cuba fell to communism, we want to note that overall containment in Latin America was actually something that worked out pretty well. Okay, that Latin America by and large was very, remained anti-communist. And so that's something, of course, there may have been a few assassinations and attempted assassinations here and there. But as far as that goes, that's going kind of beyond the territory of the exam. All right. So as far as that overthrow, yeah, and that's another thing that when you think about, yeah, it's like, communist friendly governments. And that's the whole Iran-Contra scandal. When we're looking at the Iran-Contra scandal, we are getting into, that. Okay, so when we think about the Iran-Contra scandal, that is part of that the United States was off the books financing, freedom fighters that were fighting against the, against the communist-friendly regime. Yeah, interesting there, Aaron, that it didn't go into, it didn't put your emoji there the first time. All right. So as far as that goes, Leslie, this is a matter of public opinion. Now, we'll talk about Vietnam in particular later on, but when it comes down to it, in 1968, the Tet Offensive was a military disaster for North Vietnam and the Viet Cong. That after the Tet Offensive in 1968, the United States had a solid military advantage. The problem was that the Tet Offensive and all of the footage from that and all of the body bags, that public opinion turned against the Vietnam War. So Nixon was getting into this, and Nixon, of course, was not a fan of communism. He didn't want Vietnam to fall. But then you can't say that we're going to, that we're going to keep, we're going to keep the war going or anything like that, okay? Because that wasn't going to fly. And so what Nixon talked about was peace with honor. Now, of course, that ended up being a joke, because just a few years after we got out, then actually, I don't think even a few years. It was pretty quick. But after we got out of there, it was pretty much downhill from there for South Vietnam. But Nixon really didn't have a choice. And so what he tried to do was with Operation Linebacker, which was a bombing campaign that was a successor of Lyndon Johnson's Rolling Thunder, the Linebacker campaign, and also the invasion of Cambodia, the sending the troops into Cambodia to cut off the Ho Chi Minh Trail. What Nixon was trying to do, now the Vietnamization of the war, this was, we're going to let the Vietnamese fight their own war. And this was what needed to happen for public opinion. And of course, Lyndon Johnson really just kind of went overboard with a lot of this stuff as well. But the public was tired of the war, but Nixon still wanted to try to win it. And you can't really do both. I mean, if you think about if Lincoln were to tell William T. Sherman, no, I'm not so crazy about that, that whole March to the Sea thing and burning stuff. It's kind of hard to win a war with one hand tied behind your back, And so with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank y'all so much. And it is always a pleasure. Thank you, Owen, for coming.